Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're just going to be having some fun with projecting out a future theoretical top. If you guys like the content, please subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. Also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump in. So you guys know the drill. This is our fair value logarithmic regression curve. Here is the one corresponding to the peaks. In this video, we're just going to be looking at the fair value all the way down here. And you might wonder, well, how can we simply use the fair value curve to identify where the peak is? Well, we also have this indicator here, which is just the closing price divided by the fair value and then the natural log of that number. And what you get is this nice macroscopic trend line down, right? You know, you see this if you just connect, say, this peak here to the next one, it goes pretty well through the next one as well, and we just continue on down, something like that. Now, the first thing we will say and we will note is that we know that eventually this trend line has to be broken, right? It has to be broken. Well, why does it have to be broken? Well, the reason why it ultimately will need to be broken is because, again, anything zero means that the price is, if it's below zero, it means the price is below the fair value. So technically, it doesn't have to happen if the price of Bitcoin were to eventually fall below the fair value line. However, as we've said before, we need to refit this fair value line each market cycle, because once you have many more years of data, it merits refitting, just to make sure that we're staying on top of new data coming in. But with that said, we don't want to overfit and constantly refit, because then you're just constantly refitting the curve, and that doesn't really help. So what we do, again, is we fit it through the end of the bear market, which we just identified over here as December 2018. And since then, this fair value curve of the price of Bitcoin non-bubble data has not been refit. And despite the fact that it has not been refit since this point, late 2018, early 2019, somewhere in this area, it has done pretty well. Price has gone out of it, price has gone slightly below it, but more or less it has done a pretty good representation of the price generally increasing over the last 2 years. And so our fair value is monotonically increasing as well. And right now the fair value is around $10,958. So that's where the fair value is today. So what we can do is look at these peaks and say, regardless of whether you prescribe to shorter cycles, 4-year cycles, longer cycles, whatever, you can see that we have these pretty well-defined peaks that we get every few years. To me, it looks like, obviously it looks fairly straightforward that it's lengthening, and we can also see the returns are diminishing. This is something I never understand is people that say that argue that returns are not diminishing, again, when every metric that we can measure things by, whether you measure the price, the ROI of Bitcoin from the bottom, whether you measure it from the halving, whether you do a running 1-year ROI, a running 2-year window, a 3-year window, whatever, no matter what you look at, the returns are diminishing. And it makes sense, right? It's not really that complicated. If we were to see, and honestly, to some degree, it's not even much of an argument, because if Bitcoin were to see the types of returns it saw from way over here, if you took it from this wick, let's not even take it from the wick, let's take it from this bottom here. If Bitcoin went up 60,000% like it did when it first launched from the bottom, 60,000% from this current bottom would be in one market cycle. And let's say we did it by the end of 2021, to give you an idea, it would put Bitcoin at almost $2 million. And the funny thing is most people are not calling for a $2 million Bitcoin, but of course they'll say you're not seeing diminishing returns. Okay, so it to me, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Again, even if you were to measure it from this bottom and go to the peak, you're looking at around a 53,000% move. And a 53,000% move from our local bottom of 3,100 would put us at around 1.6 million, 1.7 million. But again, most people are not calling for a 1.6 million or 1.7 million $1.7 million Bitcoin, but they'll also say that we're not experiencing diminishing returns. Now, to be fair to them, right? To be fair to them, what they're referring to most likely is simply the last market cycle, right? Ignoring the other two and just focusing on this one and saying, well, this one went up around 12,000% or so from the bottom. And if we were to go up 12,000% or so from the bottom, then we're looking at around a 300, or I mean, honestly, we'd be looking at closer to a $400,000 Bitcoin. Yet again, most people are not anticipating a $400,000 Bitcoin this market cycle, but they'll also say they don't think we're experiencing diminishing returns. Even if we were to go up to a 200 and, let's say we went up to a $200,000 Bitcoin, which I think a lot of people would think is possible, you can still see it would be about half the return that we saw from the last market cycle bottom of the previous cycle. So yes, we can always discuss whether the cycles are lengthening or not. All the time we can discuss if it's taking longer or not. But in terms of the ROI, I don't think it's much of an argument. I mean, it is decreasing no matter how you look at it, right? No matter how you look at it, there's no way you can really rearrange the data to say that the ROI is increasing or staying the same when every cycle so far, we can see that as measured from the bottom, or if you want to measure it from the halving, it's a lower ROI. So I like to have like the lengthening cycle theory and diminishing returns. It's kind of one and the same. Of course, that gets a lot of flack. For lengthening cycles, we'll have to wait and see. For diminishing return, it also seems very intuitive as well, because everyone in the crypto space would know that it's a much harder order, it's a much taller order to move a market cap of a coin from, say, it's a lot harder to move it from, say, 100 billion to a trillion than it would be to move a market cap from, say, like 1 million to 10 million. This is exactly why a lot of small altcoins will pump so hard, is because it doesn't take that much volume to make them move. And so every time that Bitcoin does inevitably do a 10x, historically speaking, it more or less seems to take longer to get there. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, I just want to keep somewhat of an open mind here and say, we'll see what 2021 holds. But in terms of looking at a diminishing ROI, prior cycles had ROIs that would have dwarfed what most people, even the most bullish people, could imagine for this market cycle. Because again, if the ROI was not diminishing from prior market cycles, then we should be expecting a $1 to $2 million Bitcoin. And if it's just from the last market cycle as measured from the bottom, then we would be expecting approximately a $400,000 Bitcoin. But again, most people will not project that number as the next theoretical top. But again, they'll still say they don't think ROI is decreasing. Anyways, from here, what I want to do is actually a little bit of fun. So we see that this is our general move, right? So peak, peak, and peak. It's decreasing because we're getting closer and closer to the fair value at the peak. So this peak was further away from the fair value than this peak, which was further away from the value than this peak, which we would project that might be further away from the fair value of this peak. Now, if we were to go to the fair value today, if we were to go to the peak as measured by this line today, we know that we just need to solve the equation, the natural log of the price divided by the fair value at that time, and then figure out what the price needs to be such that it equals, say, 1.51, because this is where that line would correspond to now. So the only thing you really need is the fair value price of Bitcoin as fit to this regression band. And if the fair value, of course, is around 11K now, then if it were to go to the peak instantaneously, meaning if it went there tomorrow or next week, then it would project that 50K would be approximately the top. So if the price were to skyrocket and start moving up, then for us to get to this macroscopic trend line that's been more or less holding us as resistance throughout these market cycles, then it would imply approximately a $50,000 Bitcoin if it were to happen, say, in the next week. A lot of people prescribe to the 4-year cycle theory, which I don't, again, but if you do, one of the common comments I get from people, and it's a fair comment, they'll say, well, hey, Ben, we know that you don't believe in a peak in 2021 of, whatever it might be, you think it's going to last longer. But could you sometimes show what your model would suggest would be the peak if in fact we did get there earlier? So if we were to go to if we were to go up this way and ultimately get to a peak in late 2021, what we need to do is we need to solve for the price that would give us the natural log of the price over the fair value equal to 1.37 or so. But the fair value at that time will be closer to $20,000, not $10,000. If that's the case, it would put it around approximately $78,000. Again, this is a pretty a loose number here because if you were to raise this slightly and change this to say 1.5, and we were to go over here and change instead of 1.37, we were to change this to 1.5, which would still be pretty well on that line, then it would give us closer to a $90,000 Bitcoin. So the point here is to say, it's easy, it's super easy to just wiggle this line a little bit and say, okay, it more or less is on par with it. But what we can say is that if in fact, what I would say is in fact, if we were to go to the peak at the end of 2021, then I would anticipate it being around six figures, probably right around 100K, maybe even a little bit less than 100K. Again, this is just based on this metric. Of course, at the end of the day, this is just an imaginary line, and to some degree, imaginary lines are made to be broken. And we know that it'll break at some point, because if it doesn't break at some point, then it ultimately implies that the price will always be below the fair value in the future. So, where does that leave us for, say, a lengthening cycle? Well, what if the peak is in, say, 2022? Let's say at the end of 2022. Well, we come down on the line, but the fair value at the time would be higher. So if the fair value at the time is around $30,000, and we just chose 1.20 as the spot on that line, it would actually give you around $100,000 Bitcoin. But again, that was more or less a lower bound on that line. If we shift it back up like we did on the last point and say, well, what if it's slightly up here, and instead it's more, say, 1.4, the log of the price over the fair value is 1.4, and we go into here and say 1.4, we solve for the price that would be overextended from the fair value at that time, and it would be closer to $120,000 Bitcoin. And then lastly, what if it takes place, what if the next peak is sometime all the way out here in, say, 2023? The fair value in 2023 should be approximately $40,000. If the spot we go on the line is 1.13, then it would put us at 123,000. But again, if we give it a little bit of flexibility like we did with the other two lines and say put 1.4 by the end of 2023, then it would put us closer to $160,000. So the point is, in my opinion, my interpretation of the data, which is always subject to have its discrepancies, the one thing any scientist will tell you is that all models are wrong, some are useful. Of course, I'm not going to be able to tell you guys exactly where the peak is. That's never my intention. But my general interpretation of the market is the longer it takes us to build up to the peak, the higher we will ultimately go. So if the peak ends up being in 2021, then I think it will ultimately be lower than it could have been had the peak been a longer build up to, say, the end of 2022, which would probably be even a lower price than if it could have built up even further past that. Now, a lot of people will say institutional money, institutional money, institutional money, and I get it. I get institutional money's coming. I don't think that institutional money is just going to storm the market over the next 12 months, and then we're going to have a massive blow off top, and then it's going to be like no one cares about crypto again for 2 years. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's more likely to happen is that we're going to have more and more institutions coming to the show, coming to join the Bitcoin party over the next several years, and it will incrementally continue to move the price up. Over the long haul, of course, nothing goes up monotonically. So hopefully that makes sense. That's generally what I want to convey in this video, is that if we go to a peak in 2021, I'm going to keep an open mind and say, you know what, we'll say it's possible. But if it does happen, then I think we would presume that the returns would be diminishing as compared to the last market cycle, as measured from market cycle bottom, which was also lower than the prior cycle before that, and was lower than the prior cycle before that. Okay, if you want to discuss why you don't think the returns are diminishing, let's do it. Let's discuss it. But provide, like, I would say, like, try to provide some evidence for it, other than just saying, it's just returns don't diminish, something like that, without actually trying to back it up in any way. So provide the data. If you can find something that implies that we might actually see increasing ROI, I'm all ears. I would love to see a $400,000 Bitcoin, a $500,000 Bitcoin in 12 months, right? Who among us wouldn't want to see that? I think everyone would want to see something like that in 12 months. And if it happens, then great, right? I mean, I think a lot of people think I'm like, I just want to like rain on their parade or something, because most people prescribe to the we're going to go to $300,000 in 12 months or something theory, and that's not my intention. I just if for instance I didn't know anything about the space and I've never even looked at cryptocurrency before, and you just gave me the price chart of Bitcoin and nothing else, I would look at it and say, well, it seems to perform fairly well. The cycles between the peaks seem to get further and further apart, and the return from the bottom, or not even necessarily measured from the bottom, because you could argue that takes into some type of bias in what you define the bottom as. Do you define it as when the halving hits? Do you define it as the actual bottom? Do you define it in some other way? That way you can also look at just running 1-year ROI, running 2-year ROI, all decreasing, all getting further apart. So this is what we want to say. I think Bitcoin should have a good next few years. 2021 could be a good year for Bitcoin. It might not be as good as some people want it to be, but I still think it could. There's a good chance it will be a decent year for Bitcoin. So ultimately, as I said, to wrap it up, the longer we spend at lower levels, I think ultimately the higher Bitcoin will fly later on at the peak of the cycle. I think that institutional money, of course, I know that it's coming, right? It's not a thought. There's clear evidence that it's coming and that it's already here. More and more of that should be coming over the next few years. I don't think it's going to be a horse race of institutions to just FOMO into Bitcoin in 2021 and then watch it come crashing down in 2022. I would argue I'm much more bullish on Bitcoin. I think the bull market can extend for several years, not just the next 12 months. And with that said, there's no guarantee that we even hold the 20-week moving average throughout 2021. There's always a chance we break it, and we gather ourselves and pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and continue on. But this is more or less my outlook on the market as we head into the next few years. If you guys like the content, please subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. Also check out the Telegram channel in the description below. We also do have the premium list. You can get access to that. The holiday sale in the description below. You get access to the weekly reports, the weekly premium videos, these trading view indicators, the risk dashboard, the Telegram alerts channel, and a few other things. Make sure you guys check it out before the prices go up. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the show. Subscribe. Let's get to 80,000 subscribers, and I'll see you next time. Bye.